Hi, my name is Dallas Tripolis, and my senior research project was on the self-esteem effects of social comparison via social media among women. First, we will begin with the abstract of the paper. The aim of the current study was to examine the self-esteem effects of social comparison via social media among women. Because social media has become a more prevalent role in our everyday lives, reliance on social networking sites will only continue to grow. With this widespread use, its influence on self-esteem is something that should be further observed. Social comparison, in particular, is a use of social media that has been implicated in producing low subjective well-being, especially in women, according to Shea 2018. Women in particular tend to compare themselves to curated images and fake online personas that are ultimately unattainable for the everyday woman. Social comparison can cause women to feel emotions of self-doubt, such as feeling not beautiful enough or that their accomplishments are unworthy. A major objective of my research was to highlight the clear impact that social comparison has on women's self-esteem after SNS use. Keywords include social comparison, self-esteem, and social networking sites, or SNS. Next, we will talk about the literature review. So, the significance of previous research. Regarding prior research, both negative and positive self-esteem effects were found when looking at women's participation in social comparison via social media. The concept of Shea 2018 was to show how social media use and personality traits affect females' envy toward influencers through social comparison. This envy causes lower self-esteem because of social comparison. Females who follow influencers online compare their lifestyles and feel less than when they constantly see their posts featuring lavish lifestyles that they cannot obtain. This is relevant to the current study because it shows a positive relationship between social comparison via social media and decreased self-esteem in women. Although research has found positive correlation between social comparison via social media and decreased self-esteem, Ho and Ito 2019 conducted research due to prior inconsistencies. These inconsistencies reported mixed results when regarding the impact of engagement in social network sites on users' self-esteem and well-being. Evidence has indicated undesirable psychological outcomes of SNS use, including negative affect, depression, and risk behaviors. But evidence has also indicated opposite findings, which documented that SNS users obtain various benefits from SNS use. Meyer and Schaefer 2018 revealed a link between social comparison and inspiration, with inspiration on Instagram related to a positive effect on self-esteem. Beneficial attributes of SNS use also include emotional and social support through positive peer feedback. Receiving likes and comments on social media has been positively associated with self-esteem. But users who are heavily driven by seeking validation online may consider the amount of likes they receive as a factor of determining their own self-worth. It is possible that this could be a trigger for a need for peer approval and cause users to construct their lives based upon what they believe will generate the desired impression that they're looking for. This increased dependence on social approval is related back to decreased self-esteem. These contrasting findings put limitations on research regarding SNS use and its effects. Though there are positive outcomes related back to SNS use, these are in contrast to the abundance of literature suggesting psychological outcomes negatively stemmed from Instagram use. Symptoms include anxiety, low self-esteem, and other risk behaviors according to Sherlock and Wagstaff 2018. So next we will discuss my research questions and hypotheses I developed for my research goals. So hypothesis 1 is that there will be a positive relationship between SNS use and low self-esteem in women. Hypothesis 2 is that there will be a positive relationship between social comparison and low self esteem in women. And hypothesis three is women who use social media frequently are more likely to participate in social comparison, which results in a decrease in one's self esteem. Next, we will talk about the methods that I used for my research. First, I chose to focus on women ages 18 through 34. I chose to focus 100% strictly on women because previous research showed social comparison can cause women to feel emotions of self-doubt. Shea 2018 discussed that women in particular tend to compare themselves to curated images and other women on social media. It was also important that participants in this study own smartphones because ownership is important for the use of social media. Participants were not asked to specify about their race. It was only required to specify about gender and age range in order to participate in the survey. So I chose to create an online survey to obtain data because a majority of previously studied research chose to use the online survey method as well. So when creating my survey, I broke it down into two parts. The first part was measuring women's social media usage. Questions focused on how often women were using social networking sites, what they were using them for, and the levels of social comparison they believed to be participating in. Women were asked to answer the following questions on a 5-point Likert scale in the following order: strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. Questions included: I would consider myself someone who uses SNSs such as Instagram frequently, or I use Instagram to keep up with daily life postings, or I often compare myself to other women on Instagram. The second part of the survey, I chose to focus my questions around measuring women's self-esteem. Shea 2018 and Ho and Ido 2019 measured similar variables in previous research using the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, a 10-item scale that measures global self-worth by measuring both positive and negative feelings about the self. All items are answered using a 4-point Likert scale, format ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Questions included: I feel that I'm a person of worth. All in all, I am inclined to feel that I am a failure. So when comparing women's answers about social media use from section 1 of the survey and their individual self-esteem score from their answers in section 2, results would determine whether or not a positive relationship could be found between social comparison via social media and decreased self-esteem in women. Results would be able to determine that social comparison mediates the relationship between consumption-oriented engagement anxiety, excessive spending, and other risk behaviors. Participants who reported that they were SNS users that valued materialistic things were highly more likely to have a lower score on their self-esteem, according to Shea 2018. So next we will move to the results section. The data collected accepted H1 because results found association between SNS use and low self-esteem in women. It also accepted H2 because results found association between social comparison and low self-esteem in women. 68% of respondents agreed that they would consider themselves to be someone who frequently uses SNS sites, accepting H3 as well, which predicted that women who use social media frequently are more likely to participate in social comparison, which can lead to decreased self-esteem. Overall, only 20% of women who took the survey reported being over the age of 20 years old. This could explain why the majority of respondents reported frequent SNS use and participation in social comparison online, since it is most common among young adults. 34% of women agreed that Instagram is their most used social media platform, and 30% also agreed that they compare themselves to other women on the app. This showed that social comparison is viable in women active on social networking sites. Over 50% of women agreed that they felt inadequate when comparing themselves to social media influencers online. These findings support H2. Social comparison can cause women to feel emotions of self-doubt, such as feeling not beautiful enough or that their accomplishments are unworthy. 25% of respondents even reported feeling useless at times after comparing themselves on social media. In order to assess women's self-esteem, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale was used when measuring the second section of the survey. Scores could range anywhere from 0 to 30. The higher the score, the higher the self-esteem would be. Scoring a 20 or up would indicate high self-esteem. The average mean reported by women on this scale conducted for my survey was 16. Confirming a lower self-esteem was reported by women who frequently used social networking sites and participated in social comparison online. When comparing women's answers about social media use from Section 1 of the survey and their individual self-esteem scores from their answers in Section 2, results determine that there is a relationship between social comparison and consumption-oriented engagement anxiety, excessive spending, and low self-esteem, because women reported high SNS use and low self-esteem scores. On average, 60% of women reported participating in social comparison when using social networking sites such as Instagram. 60% also reported answers that suggested low self-esteem, proving a positive relationship, but not specifically determining that the decrease is caused exclusively from participating in social comparison online. Limitations did not withdraw from the apparent correlation found between social comparison via social media and decreased self-esteem. Next, we'll be moving on to the discussion section of my paper. The data collected accepted H1 because results found association between SNS use and low self-esteem in women. H2 was also accepted because results found association between social comparison and low self-esteem in women. H3 was also accepted because respondents agreed to frequent SNS use and participation in social comparison, which had an effect on self-esteem in women. Limitations that were included in my research were unforeseen circumstances that prevented pencil and paper surveys to be given out, which was going to be an alternate method to my data collection. In previous research, although online surveys were used, it was noted that they often resulted in a low completion rate. Fortunately for my research, 264 surveys were completed online and allowed for a sufficient amount of data to analyze. Although an apparent relationship was found between social comparison via social media and decreased self-esteem, there wasn't enough evidence to specifically determine that lower self-esteem was caused exclusively from participating in social comparison online. Similar research has previously reported contrasting findings, which also put limitations on research regarding SNS use and its effects. Evidence has indicated opposite findings, which documented that SNS users may obtain various benefits from SNS use. Beneficial attributes of SNS use include emotional and social support through positive feedback. Though there are positive outcomes related back to SNS use, these are in contrast to an abundance of literature suggesting negative psychological outcomes stemmed from SNS use. On average, the age of participants was 19 years old. This could explain why the majority of respondents reported frequent SNS use and participation in social comparison online, since it is most common among young adults. Further research is suggested to expand on age groups and their participation in social comparison via social media. Future research is also suggested to further explore the pros and cons of social media. There was not enough evidence from this research to specifically determine that the cons of social media effects outweighed the pros that SNS use has to offer. There was also not enough data to specifically determine that lower self esteem reported by women was caused exclusively from participating in social comparison online. Only a positive relationship between the two was confirmed. Next, we will end with our conclusion. Self esteem is affected negatively when women participate in social comparison via social media. The major objective of this research was to highlight this fact and show the clear impact that social comparison has on women's self esteem after SNS use. Proving this relationship was successful. And although previous research has shown that social comparison has potential upsides, the downsides that are detrimental to self esteem cannot be overlooked. Social comparison can cause women to feel emotions of self doubt, such as feeling not beautiful enough or that their accomplishments are unworthy, when comparing themselves to other women on social media. It is important that women in particular are aware of the effects that participation in social comparison via social media has on self esteem. This research was able to contribute to further future findings by proving a positive relationship between SNS use, social comparison, participation via social media, and lower self esteem in women. Findings indicated that women who use social media frequently are more likely to participate in social comparison, which results in a decrease in one's self esteem. And these are my references. Thank you.